Welcome to What Shall We Say to These Things?
I'm MJ.
And I'm TJ, and this is your low-key ghetto Bible study.
Yeah. And this week we're looking at Esther Chapter 4. And this is the point where we ask you to pause the video and say a prayer, and then we'll get into it.
Yeah, so, as usual, we are going to look at a summary of the chapter. We'll do it in segments.
Right.
And like we said, we're doing chapter 4. So if this is the first one you're seeing, we encourage you to go back, start with our introduction to the book,
Right.
and then follow the chapters in order, because it kind of gives background context, makes things make more sense that way.
Right.
Yeah, so like I was saying, we're going to look at the chapter in segments, and at the end of each segment, we're going to talk about things that stood out to us.
Right.
And then when we're done with that, we're going to talk about what we learned about God from the chapter.
Right.
And what are the lessons we take away for our personal lives, because the end goal is always transformation.
Exactly.
So
Take
this week, my groupings were pretty chunky.
Okay.
I think because there was not a lot of action going on in this particular chapter. It was a lot more conversational, back and forth, that kind of thing. So I grouped verses 1 to 8 together, and then everything else was the second grouping.
Okay.
So in the beginning of this chapter, we have Mordecai finding out about the plot against the Jews.
Right.
And his immediate response is to tear his clothes and then put on sackcloth and ashes. And he walks through the city crying loudly and bitterly. And they tell us that he goes as far as the gate to the palace. And they're saying he could not go in because he was not allowed to come in sackcloth.
Right.
So he is at the king's gate wailing, crying, making a big scene, mourning. And in the verse that follows that, they tell us that he was not alone in his sorrow. They tell us that Jews all over Susa, not just Susa, I think they said Jews in all of the provinces,
Oh, okay.
wearing sackcloth, they are mourning, they're crying, basically just grieving this potential threat to their lives. And then we find out that Esther's servants are aware that there's some connection between her and Mordecai. This is where we figure that out, because they see him and they go to tell her.
Right.
Something's wrong with Mordecai. He's wearing sackcloth and ashes. He's crying at the gate. And so she sends him clean clothes. That was the first thing. I guess she figured if he was wearing clean clothes, he could come in to the gate and have a conversation. But she sends him clean clothes, and he refuses the clean clothes. And so what she does next is she sends a servant that she trusts, because they specify who the servant was, that he was attached to her as the queen. And so she sends this particular servant to go talk to Mordecai, find out what is going on. And the Mordecai tells the servant everything. He tells him about the death order, about the money that's promised to the king's treasury, and he gives him a copy of the decree to bring back to Esther for herself. And he tells him to tell Esther that she needs to go to the king and make a request on the behalf of her people. Right? And so that's verses 1 to 8. Right? I think my first takeaway from that, not takeaway, the first thing that stood out to me, and I think it came at based on what we discussed last time around, is that Mordecai was grieving not just the state of the pending doom of himself and his people, but I think he was also mourning the fact that this was as a result of his actions.
Oh.
I think him realizing that Haman was at the head of it, he may have put two and two together.
I never thought about that.
I think he may have put two and two together, and so his grief may have been twofold. Yes, we're all doomed, and also the fact that it may have been a thing of, I did the right thing. Why is this the outcome?
Okay.
Yeah, that was my personal take away from it. Like I guess like I'm using my imagination and making assumptions, but I feel like that may have been in part why his grief and his bitterness and his sorrow was so great. It was not just that merely their lives were on the line, but that it was maybe triggered by his actions.
I never processed it. What stood out to me is that I think it could have been. I think for most of us, there are times when like you crying and somebody's about to see you and you could stop, right? You could stop and you could go to the bathroom,
Compose yourself.
Compose yourself. And the fact that Mordecai refused to do that, because he could have pulled himself together, put on the clothes, gone in and talked to Esther, but his grief, his distress was so strong, it was so real, and I think he wanted to communicate that to her as well. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to.
I'm inconsolable.
Right. Yeah, and that stood out to me as well, and I think that would be reflected. That would be as a result. Him being inconsolable would be as a result of your point that he could have been grieving his part in it as well. Yeah, that it puts the whole chapter in a different light if you look at it that way.
Yeah.
That he feels somewhat responsible. That's interesting.
Yeah. So my second point comes down from the bottom of that segment where I found it interesting that even in the state of his grief, even in the state of his inconsolable grief, that he was still somehow focused on a solution.
Okay.
He was like, you're in a position to do something, you go do something. Okay? And I think I guess I'm slipping into the how I should live my life with this one. But I think sometimes it's difficult to do that. And so I gained a new level of respect for Mordecai, where he was able to, even in the depth of his despair and the full weight of his grief, he was able to say, what is a possible way for us to deal with this situation? How can we address this? How can we find some hope in the middle of this like death threat, this chaos, you know? And so that was my second thing that stood out to me, that he, even in the most dire of the circumstances, in the worst part of the situation, he was looking for solutions.
Yeah, that's interesting. Mordecai, is going up higher and higher in my books.
Yeah. Anything else you want?
Not on this part. I think everything else I have is related to the next part.
Okay. Alright, so let's look at verses 9 to 17. So, basically the servant comes back to Esther and tells her, Mordecai says, you need to go to the king. And Esther is like, the poorest of people to the richest of people. Like, everybody across the board knows that if you go to the king without him requesting for you, you're gonna die. Like, unless he holds out his golden scepter. And then she goes to add on, and he hasn't called for me in a hot minute.
Yeah, and a month.
She's like, I feel like I'm not in his best books right now. He's not calling for me. And everybody knows if anybody, like, regardless of who you are, goes without him calling, you're gonna die. Alright? And I think Mordecai's response to her, which comes next, is interesting, because he tells her, you don't be out here thinking that you're safe in your pretty palace. Like, if you refuse to try and be part of the solution, deliverance will come from somewhere else. The Jews will be saved somewhere or another. But you and your family will die. And then he says, consider that you may be queen for this very time. Like, this is the occasion, this is the purpose of you being queen. And I guess that was a bit of a reality check for her, because she then sends back message to him to tell him, gather all the Jews in Susa together. You're going to pray and fast for me for 3 days. I will gather all my maids and I will do the same, and then I will go to the king. And if I die, I die. And I think it's the King James version that says, if I perish, I perish. And that is how the
chapter ends.
And so, and Mordecai, then, it tells us that Mordecai then goes and does exactly what she says. And I feel like it would have been interesting if the chapter had ended with, if I perish, I perish. Like, you know, like real dramatic stuff.
Yeah.
But, yeah, and so that's how the chapter ends. With Mordecai. Interestingly enough, we have this flip of the usual, where she's usually the one obeying Mordecai, and now we have Mordecai doing what she says.
She's giving him instructions.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I think there's as you were speaking, there were things, things jumping out to me. So, number one, I think, I'm not sure if Esther is being, like, rude, or if she genuinely thinks the grief has gotten to him, and he's forgotten. Because the way she says it is like, this is...
How do you not know this?
How do you not know this? Yeah. Why would you ask me to do that? And I've always thought that Mordecai's response is harsh. I've always thought it. But in studying it this time, because I've always thought that Esther was safe. Haman doesn't know she's a Jew. And from the looks of it, we don't know, because the king might have known. He might just not have known that it was the Jews being
that's
killed.
the point.
So that's a possibility. But I always thought that she was safe, that nobody knew who she was. But then you have so much interaction between her and Mordecai, and you have, if nobody had known, now they do, because Mordecai gives the instructions to the eunuch, communicating between them, and so now at least one person in the palace knows. And reading it this time, I noticed that the decree going out, I had always thought about it as in, okay, so this decree is for people like Haman, people who don't like the Jews, who think that they're encroaching on their territory and they want their wealth. But it was an order.
Yeah.
It was an order. It was a kill the Jews, not a, if you want to kill the Jews, you can go ahead. It was an order. And so by not attacking the Jews, you could have been disobeying the king's order.
Yes. Yeah.
And that put everything into perspective. For me, Esther was not safe in the palace. As much as she felt comfortable.
Especially in the palace.
Exactly.
Where people would have had a greater allegiance and alliance to the king.
Exactly.
Where obedience to the king was of, like, utmost importance. This is his space. So obeying him in his space is the most important thing. And so Jews in the palace were the least safe.
Yeah. That was something new and eye-opening for me. That she wouldn't be safe. But it's interesting to me that Mordecai will say, you and your father's house. It's up until now, this girl has been like a daughter to him. But it's so easy for him to separate the lineage, in a case like this.
I don't know that it's necessarily a separation, because we don't know if there's anybody left from her father's house.
Well, we don't know.
Yeah, so I don't even know if it's necessarily a separation of lineage, but I think it had to do with the fact that, I was just thinking about it, and I was thinking, there were people who would have known Esther before she became queen. She's been living with Mordecai for so many years. There would have been people who knew her before she was queen. And there would have been people who knew her relation to Mordecai. And I don't know, I guess maybe that's my thing, but we're assuming that when he said her father's house, he meant her literal father and not himself.
Oh, wow, okay.
Because I mean, I don't think that he necessarily did mean himself.
But it could mean you and the people you care about. Yeah.
Because I guess we don't know at what point she was orphaned, but he was the closest family that she had. And we're realizing now that this whole plan, this whole scheme was to get rid of Mordecai first and foremost.
Okay.
And so I feel like personally Haman himself would have been the one to go and try to kill Mordecai. And I think he would have done his due diligence to find out who the members of Mordecai's family were when it was the time. And so I think while it may have been a thing about not just you not safe, in the palace, it was also, you are my relative, you are really not safe.
Okay.
So I think it was a little bit more loaded, because I think Mordecai at that point was accepting his death. Well, not necessarily accepting his death, but like,
I don't think so.
well, more like he was accepting that he was a target.
Okay.
Not necessarily the death, because I think that point where he says that deliverance will come from somewhere else.
I saw it for the first time this morning. Reading the chapter, it blew my mind. I wanted to read the verse, because he says, this is verse 14. He says, this is the New Living Translation version. He says, if you keep quiet at a time like this, deliverance and relief for the Jews will arise from some other place. Not if deliverance and relief arises. And that's incredible to me. Like, this man in sackcloth, covered in ash, crying, right, is capable of that level of faith.
But I think it's interesting that he says that the deliverance for the Jews will come from somewhere else, just as he's also saying that you and your family will die.
Oh.
So for me, that was an interesting contrast. Like, is it that he's saying everybody else, or is it that he's saying that even though you and your family die, the entire Jewish population will not be wiped out?
Okay, that makes sense. Because, well, they can't have, I guess, based on prophecy, they could not have believed that God would let them be wiped out
entirely, I guess.
Right. Yeah, but this was something I'd never read, I'd never thought about before. I'd always thought it said if deliverance comes from somewhere else, you will be disgraced, essentially. But to see him say that it's going to come, yeah. But it would be nice if you were part of the solution. Yeah.
But like the only point I actually had written down for this one is that Esther had been living as a Persian for 6 years. We had the first year where she was preparing to be the queen, and then the 5 years where she's been queen. And I think her response to Mordecai was in accordance to that. She's been living as a Persian woman, and for her, this was a reminder that you may have been living as a Persian woman, but you, my dear, are a Jew.
Okay.
And so I think her final response to Mordecai is in accordance to that wake-up call.
Okay. Yeah, I've experienced something like that, in the sense that I forget my age all the time. And then they say something about adults, and somebody's looking at me, and I have to process that, yes, in fact, MJ, you are an adult. So I think I could relate to her forgetting who she was. Right. Definitely. And I don't know if this is going into what we can take away as living our lives, but she gets the reality check, she gets the wake-up call, and she goes straight into prayer and fasting, and not just she, but the entire city of Susa.
All the Jews, yeah.
All the Jews in Susa. So that to me is a clear indication that a return to her roots, a return to her religion.
Yeah,
I
definitely.
think that you could see somewhat of a revival, a reformation happening in Esther's life.
Definitely. And because you've not brought it into like personal, but I think it's a good reminder for us that sometimes when we have strayed from who we're supposed to be, that the turning point for us needs to be in focusing on getting our spiritual life right.
Definitely.
Okay, so your takeaways about God. What did you learn about God from?
Okay. It's something you mentioned last week in chapter 3. But to me, it's even it's a recurring theme throughout this book that at any point God could have intervened. He could have had revealed to Xerxes that, hey, Haman is plotting against the Jews. Your wife is a Jew. You should do something about it. Or he could have he could have made it so that Haman never found out that Mordecai wasn't bowing. He could have intervened, spoken to Haman and told him, no, you're not going to wipe out all my people. But he does not intervene, and he lets these things unfold. And in this chapter, we can see one result is that there's a citywide revival.
Yeah.
And so I think these terrible things have to happen sometimes for some of us to wake up and be like, okay, I've forgotten who I am. I've lost my identity, and it's time to return to God.
That's definitely a good takeaway.
And that's that also bleeds into the what can we
for your personal life.
Personal life. I think anytime we're facing something, especially as serious as death, life and death, Esther is either way. She doesn't go to the king. She's facing death, possible death. She goes to the king. She's facing she's definitely facing possible death. And so this in critical moments like that in our lives, the only place to go, the only person to turn to is God. To get direction, to get peace, that's really all we can do.
You made the point a while ago that sometimes these things have to happen to remind us of our identity. But for me, I guess maybe it's part and part, but for me it had to do with purpose. Because Mordecai tells her, maybe you are queen for this time. Maybe you being queen is part of your purpose in this particular moment. And so I think it's twofold. Sometimes we need to have those situations to rough us up a little bit so we can get back on track in terms of not just who we are, but what we're supposed to be doing.
Wow.
How we're supposed to be living. And secondly, I think sometimes we need a Mordecai to be like, you confused? Honey, you are confused? Maybe this is, suck it up. Maybe this is what you're here to do. Maybe this is what you're here for. And sometimes we get off track with our purpose and we just need that jolt. And so we need to be open to some of the uncomfortable situations. And not necessarily somebody like threatening to kill your entire family. I think that's a bit extreme. But I think, just things that rub us the wrong way. Sometimes even people that rub us the wrong way. We need to be, I need to be, because this is about what I'm applying to my life. I need to be more open to those types of things because I should always be looking to hear what God's will for me is, what He's placed me in situations and circumstances for His glory and what He wants me to do.
Excellent. I just looked at my notes and I saw something else. It's a shade of what we're talking about with Esther. Sometimes we think there's less risk in not standing up. But in a case like this, it was almost equal. Even though not going to see the king was easier, it
was not safer.
It wasn't necessarily the safer choice. And so I think that could influence, in situations where silence is an option or speaking out. One might seem easier, but it's not necessarily the safer option.
Or the right one.
Not necessarily the right one. Yeah. So, anything else you notice?
I can't think of anything at the moment. I think I've gone through most of my notes.
Yes, I think, and I think our dogs think we're done with this conversation as well. So that was chapter 4. We're interested to hear what are your thoughts, what we can learn about God from this chapter and how we should live our lives.
And even things that stood out to you from this chapter.
Yeah. Anything new you noticed, we'd love to hear it in the comments.
And join us next week as we get into chapter 5. So we're inviting you during the course of the week to read chapter 5. Take notes of things that stand out to you. What are the things that you learn about who God is and how he works? And what are the things that you can apply in your life? How can you live differently?
Yep. So this has been What Shall We Say to These Things? I'm MJ.
And I'm TJ. And until next time,
We're out.